And I want to invite up our next speaker, who has courageously agreed to take the stage by himself, despite the fact that I'm in a little box looking in on you all. And as I said, not really able to see everyone. Well, there we go. There we go. I can now see everyone. And I see that David has come up. David.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure, an absolute pleasure. I suppose I can virtually refer to you here. This sort of keeps the connection with the pandemic, where there's still something virtual about this whole thing this morning. But thanks very much, Kieran. I'm sorry to hear you're stuck there, but it's great that you're still able to do all of this, and it's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you, and I just wish that the pandemic were virtual and only virtual. But David, I don't think I need to introduce you. Everybody knows you. And we previewed you yesterday. You got to get on some themes. And I want to start out with one of the things that you said yesterday that is really kind of near and dear to my heart, without philosophizing or going on too much. And that is, it seems to me that the great accomplishment of the FATF and of the APG has been to bring people together, to bring countries together on an agreed upon standard. And we know they're not all abiding by it. Nobody, at this point, nobody says it's a bad standard. People are increasingly saying, yes, they're certainly giving lip service to that standard. And you raised just a great issue, and that is that we may be coming to a time, all of this accomplishment, all of this that has been accomplished is a little bit threatened now by a world, and I mentioned it in the sanctions talk, a world that's being divided between a sense of what's right and wrong. I think that's the term that you use it. We're not having the same agreed upon definitions of right and wrong. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. A few things, but first of all, I suppose to talk a little bit about the FATF project overall. You're right that it is, the FATF is one of these, as this soft law body. It's not formed by treaty, and neither of the regional bodies like APG, the FATF style regional bodies, but it has been a project that's brought together, I think there are 185 or something jurisdictions in the global network of the FATF. And so those jurisdictions come together to commit to the FATF standards and then to do their best to implement those standards. We can talk about judgments on doing the best or not, but really at its heart...
And we will.
Yeah, we will. I'll be careful. But really at its heart is really about the fundamentals of international cooperation. So yesterday I mentioned a number of times the desire for level playing fields and for kind of common approaches so that transnational activities of businesses are supported to protect those economies and financial activity. And also so that the best lessons and the best tools are available to national authorities between jurisdictions, but that are flexible and that can recognise national circumstances to be implemented. That having been said, that there are real challenges with the standards in some of those areas. So it's not meant to be a one-size-fits-all approach, but actually a lot of stuff looks very similar country to country. And we heard, absolutely fair remarks yesterday from the head of compliance at BSP that there are some of these standards that really don't fit comfortably in some very low-capacity small island states and other jurisdictions. But fundamentally, the FATF, a number of the standards, or many of the standards within the FATF standards relate to international cooperation directly, but many more of them support international cooperation. And a lot of the work of FATF and its regional bodies, such as the APG, is to bring together officials and to support practitioners and the private sector coming together. So even through the political headwinds, and we obviously are in and going into possibly worse times for this. Actually, my observation is that at this practitioner level, there is a surprising amount of cooperation. As an example, there are 4 Chinas amongst the APG's membership. So there's China, Hong Kong, China, Macau, China, and Chinese Taipei. And at a practitioner level, what we see is that actually, if you were to carefully look in the halls, you see practitioners from all of those jurisdictions working together, talking about cases, finding a way around the kind of politics to do the work that needs to be done. And having led the mutual evaluation of Chinese Taipei, I know that's true also from compliance officers' perspectives in financial institutions, of finding ways to work with financial institutions either side of the straits and so on. So there is some hope that these soft law bodies actually are a way for things to sort of keep going. There's a broader philosophical question about sort of how much things harden up that I don't have an answer for, and I'm not a political scientist, but I think I sort of hope that these things are the last to go. Some of you would have read the FATF statement from the meetings last week in Berlin. So the FATF issued a fresh statement on the Russian Federation and on the Ukraine. Sorry, they issued a fresh statement on the Ukraine. And that included some elements of suspension of the Russian Federation from certain FATF activities that were mentioned in that statement. So it's a measure, I suppose, that while FATF is a wholly technical body, and as are the regional bodies, but actually there are political manifestations, of course, that affect the work. So it's a very difficult period, but it's one that's a consistently moving feast. You might ask, I got cut off a lot yesterday, and I'm here on my own, which is great. And apologies, I'm a bit of a talker. But one of the things...
I will interrupt if need be.
Yeah, thanks. You might have going to be asking me about Russian sanctions and FATF, and you'd know that the FATF standards don't extend to sanctions related to the Ukraine, to the war in the Ukraine. So but still the topic and the sort of structures and the infrastructure and the standards that are there in the FATF standards, and as we heard yesterday in the sanctions discussion, that they do complement and actually support a lot of these autonomous sanctions regimes from being rolled out.
Well, let me talk then about the other recurring topic in your remarks yesterday, and actually I think one of the elephants in the room. I'm going to ask you broadly about it to begin with. Our ACAMS' own Rick McDonald always points out that there is a lot of quibbling over who did better on the mutual evaluation report and who did worse. And his point is always, well, they all did badly, really, when you look at the standards and what's involved. So even the boasters. So what can you say about where we are now? The majority of states have been examined, the new effectiveness regime, and how are people doing? Are we still all doing badly?
Yep. Look, the FATF put out a report which caused a lot of tears and hair pulling when it was being debated. It's a very bureaucratic organisation when it comes to putting out reports about its own performance, but that FATF spent 2.5 years doing its strategic review into assessments. It wasn't a strategic review into the totality of the FATF standards and its work and the project. It was very much focused on the nature of its assessments and really what to do next on assessments. And as part of that, it did put out a document, and I should have remembered the name of the document before coming up on stage, but which you can find on their website, which is a sort of snapshot of how things have gone in the round. And they've been pretty frank that FATF, that overall across the global network, things have got a long way to go, and that there are some areas of strength, but there are significant delays in core parts of the standards being implemented at a technical level, let alone on effectiveness. They were also pretty frank that in a number of areas where they gave themselves pretty high marks on effectiveness, for example, in asset recovery, the numbers are actually terribly low in relation to actually what portion of the estimated criminal proceeds ever get anywhere near of being identified and repatriated to national authorities and then shared from those countries or jurisdictions where they were generated. So in that area, even though, again, it's properly disguised in very bureaucratic FATF language, they've been quite direct about that. And unsurprisingly, the picture with a lot of the regional bodies, because the FATF as the Global North Club are the bigger economies with higher capacity, it's tougher for developing economies and jurisdictions of lower capacity. And so the picture is overall, for developing economies, it's not as strong. That having been said, there are some standouts. So for example, amongst the APG membership, the first APG member to come into compliance with all 40 recommendations to be compliant or largely compliant was Macau, China. And in fact, it was the first jurisdiction globally to come into compliance. And no FATF members had done so at that point. So there is further to go. And so the FATF pointed out other thematic areas where there are particular challenges on beneficial ownership, on the pace of coverage of designated non-financial businesses and professions, still international cooperation. Despite all of this work, there are so many things that get in the way, and they're not necessarily political. So they're pretty clear, and so I can talk a bit later about what comes next. But it was part of the driver at the highest political levels of why the FATF needs to keep up the pressure and find a way to overcome some of these global challenges that have been identified. Sorry, I should have said it also found that in terms of the dent it's made into preventing financial crime, it didn't really study that very closely, but you can read between the lines that this hasn't really been a huge success on that sort of measure. You know, it isn't like that the tendency of the globe towards criminal conduct and the profits from crime and the financing of proliferation of WMD and of terrorism, and we heard so much yesterday on that topic as well. That challenge remains as urgent as ever.
Well, we're starting to have questions come in, and I want to encourage those questions. So please do send them. I will try to get to as many of them as possible. So you mentioned a couple of trends. One, that despite movement on asset recovery, there's not as much asset recovery as there could be. You also talked about some progress among some of the smaller nations, and that was encouraging. Anything else that we could say about like that you're seeing, maybe even anything alarming in the trends from the evaluation so far, or anything in addition to what you said that's encouraging?
Alarming. Many of these problems are reasonably perennial.
I'm a journalist, so I use.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, but you get a catch here. I'm trying to think. I'll come up with a juicy line in a minute. Look, no. I mean, some of the challenges are sort of ones that have been there almost from the beginning. One of the things, it's not alarming, but I suppose it's just a feature of national systems that even in high capacity countries, there is a real challenge to build a culture of this stuff in enforcement agencies, for example, that developing good people and keeping them, for example, in financial investigations and prosecutions, and them having a stellar career in that area is a challenge. I mean, many of you find this in the private sector as well. In the world, I'd say that there's a tendency towards being a successful generalist rather than being a true specialist. And this can be a real challenge, and you've been speaking so much, and I know in the halls especially, about the challenge of finding and developing good people and enough resources, but getting the people and the systems you've got to do a better job and to really do the tasks that need to be done really well, and finding better and more efficient ways. And so that this remains a real challenge, and I see it even a challenge at the policy level, that getting the right ideas to the policy table at FATF, and they admit it, is a challenge as well. And so, for example, on the topic of beneficial ownership, looking again for FATF Rec 24 and 25, so the transparency of companies and legal persons and the transparency of trusts and other legal arrangements, it's a real challenge to find real experts who can understand this stuff really well and have sufficiently well-tested ideas to make a real difference in this area, to design tools in the standards that are really going to work for all of you. And especially to avoid designing tools that are going to make things worse. And this is one of the biggest challenges on setting very technical international standards like this, that if they're not done well, it can cost a small fortune, and to national governments and to enterprises and so on, and really get in the way of economic activity, but more important, sometimes fundamental rights. And this is a real concern about the legitimacy of the work that FATF and the regional bodies do, and that we all do in compliance, about protecting property rights and human rights is really an important part. So keeping that on the table is an important thing. So it has been alarming at various times over the last 20 years in this area about moving quickly in these areas, and that the balance that was mentioned yesterday about between data privacy and AML/CFT controls. But a good thing is that FATF is looking, and it has its eyes open more on this topic now, with looking at some unintended consequences and being a bit more active in engaging with these challenges that have been raised about the effects of some of the FATF standards as they're rolled out.
So we do have questions coming in. A couple of tough ones, so I'll just tee you up with that. But this one is about the risk-based approach. That's a foundation of AML and everything else. And the question is kind of, when we do the mutual evaluations, is this really taking into account the risk-based approach? Nobody does well. Maybe there needs to be more of a risk-based approach in the evaluations, or would you argue that there sort of is already?
No, that's a reasonable question, and I think, and there's a criticism in the question, which again is fair. Look, one of the findings and through the strategic review at FATF is that actually that while some of you, the brave ones, might have read the assessment methodology, it's again extremely bureaucratic, but really it's really trying to reinforce with the way these assessments have done, looking at risk and context, so the materiality of the jurisdiction and its economy and the sectors, and then how the emphasis and the weighting that's given to different parts of the national system and of the AML CFT CPF controls that are in play there. And so to properly recognise riskier and less risky areas and sort of focus the findings and the recommended actions and weighing things when giving scores. And that hasn't necessarily been the way that it's played out over the round. And so you see some economies where you might think because of their small size and their lack of integration into the international financial system and the nature of crime that is in that economy, including in the very sparse risk assessments that might have been done there, that probably they shouldn't have done too badly, but still is it that assesses themselves, and assessing bodies still in some part, and I'm the one who's the author of so many of these, is fall back on also checking the boxes as well, because you've got your supervisor, Nicole, who was here yesterday, and then the FATF is supervising the national authorities, and the teams that are doing the assessments are being supervised by the plenary at FATF. And so there is that sort of cascading where everybody is making sure that, and we also mark them down here and here, because no one, people get too worried if they see too many compliance in an assessment. So there's been, I have a sense that we hope that there's a reckoning of that sort of approach being knocked on the head a lot more than before. The proof will be in the pudding in the next round, which I'll talk about in a minute, but really trying to really recognise, to actually focus on, because effectiveness really needs to be taken into account much more deeply, the risk-based approach really has to be considered more deeply at the same time. We can't do both. We can't have much more of a rules-based assessment. Applying the effectiveness assessment in a kind of rules-based way, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
I said there's hard questions. Is the influence of the FATF weakening? Australia, for example, where there's been little desire to regulate NFTs, goes on. Thoughts about the poll and what I've certainly seen there are countries that do change because of the FATF. But what would you say to that?
I'm biased, first of all, but I would generally say no. And then some measures. So the work of the FATF is very strongly supported by the G20 and the UN and other key international bodies. And I mentioned yesterday the meeting of FATF ministers in April this year, and so they have committed to biennium, so that every 2 years those ministers will come together and will have a work plan that they will drive forward, and will report to the G20 on that. And then more broadly, the FATF reports and interacts with the G20 quite closely. And so at that global level, in terms of political commitment from the biggest economies in the world, the most strategically important jurisdictions, that commitment is stronger than ever. And you'll see in some areas, and we talked yesterday a little bit about beneficial ownership, and we mentioned rulemaking in the United States, that this is an area where there hadn't been a lot of movement until recently, but the US is moving in this area in a lot of other countries as well. And the European Union and their standard, now the fifth directive. So the work of FATF, I actually think is getting more central to a lot of areas of global governance of economies, and certainly, of course, the financial system. And then some particular areas, the area of virtual assets of crypto. So the FATF standard on this for FATF, Rec 15, on virtual assets, and what FATF world we call virtual asset service providers, or VASPs. I know when we talk to actual exchanges and we use the word VASPs, they look confused and ask me what I'm talking about, but for FATF, they love a new good acronym. Excuse me. But the movement there, and then the work that's going on there, I think because there's the centrality of this area, so digital transformation and FATF being part of that, I think makes it increasingly relevant. Well, maintains its relevance, and I suppose it's your question about its influence and power. The ICRG, sorry, last one, then ICRG, so the barrel of the gun for FATF, it remains, and so one of the decisions of the strategic review is that the ICRG process will continue, and the thresholds to go in there have been lowered, and some areas of the process have been tightened. So the procedures there have been published already for the next round, which won't start for a few years. But this has also been an area where, even though relatively few jurisdictions go into the ICRG process, but it's the spectre of ICRG actually is part of the reason why so much heed is given to FATF in the financial sector and then by national authorities.
Well, as you said, we're going to talk a little bit about the new processes in the future, and maybe I'll soften this next question. Why does it take 9 to 10 years to return to Australia to revisit mutual evaluation reports, and with little progress being made on tranche 2? And I guess to put the other side of that too is that the process is going to change. Let's talk about more frequent examinations going forward, and although then, so that's A, and then B, how would that be if there's not a lot more resources? But anyway, talk about that.
Sure. That doesn't feel like a softer question, but that's okay.
Well, I softened it with, you're going to, this is all being fixed.
We used a nice voice, so it's fine. So a couple of things. First of all, FATF...
Yeah, I didn't ask that question. No.
So FATF had great plans at the start of the current round in 2012, that it had its brand new effectiveness methodology, and it did these very difficult assessments, which took a lot more resources than they thought they would do in the beginning, despite some of us having promised them it would cost more. And then there would be technical compliance follow-up, and then at the 5th year point there would be a large effectiveness review again, not the whole thing again, but looking at some hotspots and then reassessing on effectiveness and work out what to do next. So when they started the round, as I said, they realised things were more resource intensive than they had led themselves to believe. And then preparing for the 5th year follow-up assessments, they hadn't quite settled on the process, and again, it was going to be very resource intensive. And so in the end, after assessing 2 countries, and that is Spain and Norway, they abandoned the 5th year follow-up process. And so the rest of FATF membership and all the other FSRB members actually, none of them have had an effectiveness review since they have had the mutual evaluation in this round. And so that trigger was meant to be one of the key ones for many jurisdictions, including Australia and others, they're doing a much closer look at their system. There is an expectation in the FATF rules that are published that all jurisdictions, all FATF members, and it's the same with the APG, will come into full compliance within 3 years of being assessed.
So,
sorry, one more thing, and then the second question. Sorry, I just was leaving a pregnant pause.
Yeah. Go ahead. All right.
The next round. So, and then COVID is here, and so the assessments have just started up again at FATF and the other regional bodies, but these fresh decisions about the next round, and so I can talk about that a bit if you like, but that's sort of how we got to the point where not all jurisdictions have had the same sort of level of follow-up. Sorry, last thing on that, the 3 years expectation, but there's a fair bit of flexibility about whether jurisdictions ask to be reassessed against the standards that they haven't passed. And some APG and FATF members ask all the time and have had a lot of upgrades, and some don't.
So we do have a lot of questions about tranche 2 and things like what kind of pressure is being put on the Australian government to move ahead with tranche 2. Maybe I'll try to roll up some of these questions so that we may move on from some of tranche 2. And yesterday I think you said it was unlikely that that Australia would be put on the grey list. Although you also mentioned there is the FATF grey list and the EU grey list. What can we say about that before moving on?
So for FATF members, for all FATF members, as I said, it's highly unusual for FATF to list their own members. Iceland was listed in this round. And in the new assessments, and so we can look back at the results that countries achieved in the current round, and maybe play them forward if countries were to be assessed in a similar way. But we're in a different world now, and also some of the technical compliance standards have changed. So there's the new standard for virtual assets and VASPs. There will also be the new standard for proliferation financing. So that is more a risk-based approach in relation to countries assessing the risks of proliferation of WMD, financing proliferation of WMD, and then the requirement of all of you to do enterprise assessments and respond to those. And also all the moving parts in relation to sanctions, especially the supervision of these requirements. So that standard is higher, and the effectiveness review there will be a wider one. There has been that the decision on the next round for assessments was that essentially they would go again on, in these assessment reports there are 11 immediate outcomes for effectiveness that are being reviewed. So that they will again use, in general terms, the same methodology for assessing compliance with some slight changes. And the main changes relate to how they divide the assessment of financial institutions broadly, and then designated non-financial businesses and professions. And so essentially they're going to split them that way, whereas before we looked at the whole topic of regulation and how well all the covered entities are sort of doing in relation to implementing all of the preventive measures, and that is financial institutions, banks, et cetera, and DNFBPs were all over here. And then the second part was the question of supervision and enforcement overall. But instead they're going to split them apart, so it'll be regulation, implementation and supervision and enforcement for FIs over here, and also for the virtual asset providers over here, and then on this side designated non-financial businesses and professions as a second separate immediate outcome. So that's probably the only structural change in effectiveness reviews, and then it hasn't been finalised yet, but then also the whole topic of beneficial ownership, the requirements at a technical level, and then how that will be assessed will have changed. So that's a bit of a changed field for all Fatf members coming in to be assessed, and so that changes the betting, I suppose, on the thresholds. And then I said before, I think the thresholds for going into ICRG, it's a bit easy to go into ICRG in relation to the number of pass-fail points that you score, and so. Yes, and so that's why I said yesterday, it's a sort of theoretically any FATF member could go into the ICRG depending on their scores in the next round.
Well, I guess that it's also fair to say that Australia is not alone in lagging the standards, and I think it'll be sort of a cold day in hell when the American Bar Association allows lawyers in the U.S. to follow the regime. But that leads to, we talked about VASPs, and can we talk a little bit about, where's the region with regards to addressing oversight? The region and then Australia, New Zealand with regards to addressing oversight, crypto, DeFi, which we touched on a little bit yesterday with Nicole Rhodes.
Sure. Well, it's really challenging, is what I would say, in that there are so many challenges. A big part of it actually is that national authorities across the region really struggle to actually understand the sector, to know who's out there, what it is that they would regulate, and without sort of thinking about it in a kind of banking model is the challenge. And so it really, what we hear back from APG members is that sort of a basic piece on awareness raising in relation to the nature of services that relate to virtual assets, and so the kind of complexity there, or even the simpler stuff. So unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is that there is a tendency to prohibit first, and then think about doing something later in relation to a well-structured regulatory framework, which what we've also seen is that that doesn't seem to work either, because the ability to enforce a prohibition in most APG members is not there, because again, you'd have to understand what you were looking at and then how you would find them and then what action you would take. So there is a pressing need actually for I think for the FATF and the regional bodies, but also national authorities to work with the sectors to actually have a dialogue and for awareness raising, and to work together and to inform the design of systems. And so we've seen that quite successfully in many jurisdictions and of doing risk assessments, but there's really a long way to go. So I didn't bring the numbers, but I think about half of APG members have done a technical compliance review of where they're up to with Rec 15, and the numbers aren't great. And it's the same globally, and actually it's pretty similar with FATF as well. Even those countries that are looking to have some level of compliance by having an enforceable prohibition, then they can't actually go and enforce that. So the FATF is doing good work in this area. It has a virtual assets contact group in its policy-making area, which does quite a lot of outreach, and it's, I suppose the takeaway from this conference is that I've had the pleasure to have met a couple of exchanges here, and I think there's a real need for sort of more businesses from our region to be more closely involved in that outreach work, because to help inform FATF, which helps other national governments to move forward on this. My observation is that the guidance and the issues papers that FATF is putting out on this area is actually some of its best work at the moment, because it's trying to dive deeply into the nature of the environment here and to explain a lot of it to various authorities, but there can always be more work to be done on that. Again, this is an area where there's a lot of emphasis at the highest level, so this was part of the Fatf ministers' statement in April, and from the G20, that they want FATF to really push on with this work. And so various moving parts of it, the travel rule and other things, but many of the fundamentals are still to be done. So it's a really important part, I think. And so I think a lot of countries in the region are looking to leading economies like Australia and other key financial centres in the region, New Zealand, and then especially Singapore and Hong Kong and others, about what steps are being taken and what models might be suitable in the region. And then we also need to think about what models would be suitable in a low capacity country where there are real opportunities here. I should have said at the beginning that knee-jerk reaction to prohibit, that there are real concerns that this is one of these unintended consequences, that there are so many opportunities that we can see for virtual assets and these services being a part of really important economic development across the region, and we want to make sure that even though FATF and APG are not bodies that focus on economic development, but these are the fundamentals of well-working markets and financial systems, and that for what could be fantastic avenues of new financial services, in particular bringing in the unbanked and those that are outside of formal financial systems, that we've got to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater on that one. So that's sort of part of the discussion that we're trying to bring into the FATF discussion, is to think about from the perspective of small economies, small island states, et cetera. So work's going on, but we kind of really need to hear more. And I think a part of this actually, there is something that can be done really by all the financial institutions and others that are here, is that your enterprise risk assessments, how you look at the phenomenon of risk and your engagement with virtual assets, feeding that back to the regulator is a really important part, because it keeps the national authorities informed and helps to shape their responses when they come to regulate that sector. So kind of explaining the opportunities to them as well as the risks, I think, is a key part of it, because they get so much from your understanding of the market and your understanding of the risks and risk mitigation in the market. That really guides regulators, is what we see in the region.
So I wanted to ask, this is a question from the audience, and I think that it relates a little bit to the new technologies and where we're going. And the question is, it seems that a verifiable digital identity is going to be key to addressing money laundering and terror finance issues in the future. Do you have views on the role that digital can play, and is there active FATF consideration in this space?
I'm old enough to remember the Australia card. For those of you who want to say a dirty word, please don't quote me on that. That was an internal thought. So FATF, of course, always focuses on verification, and there's no point collecting data if there's no way to actually have an understanding of where that goes. And so it's always part of the discussion in the mix about what's the role of digital transformation and identity points is just absolutely fundamental to all of the work that FATF does, and its standards and the work that it does across its global network, really about transparency of the economy and of actors in the economy and transactions and so on. So it certainly doesn't have a standard to say that every country needs to have a certain type of identification system, not at all. But it's something that you all grapple with about how can you have adequate data points to verify identity and other data points. And I mentioned a little bit yesterday about concerns, and others raised it as well, about, for example, about beneficial ownership registries and how these can tie together with other data sets, and this is going to be an important part of it, and then data protection issues around all of that. So the data protection work that FATF has been doing under the just finished German presidency at FATF has been an important part of that, and that has certainly come into the mix as well. So it's a continuing discussion, and one that all national authorities need to consider on the way through. In many jurisdictions in the Asia Pacific region, there is a well-established and increasingly high-tech systems for these things, and their implementation is mixed in different jurisdictions, but it's certainly not a silver bullet to kind of cure all your verification problems. But so it continues, the debate continues.
So David, we have still a lot of questions about Australia and its compliance, as you might imagine. I don't know if you want to say anything more. One is sort of, is Australia being realistic about how its actual compliance versus what it does? So we may move on from these and give you a chance to talk about some other things, but lots of questions about putting into perspective. I mean, why is, it's my impression, and New Zealand does so much better, or at least better, somewhat better, put it that way. Thoughts about where Australia sits? Yeah.
Look, I don't have an answer to those questions because you won't know until.
And you have to live here.
I live here, yeah. First of all, I live here. And also, we won't know till we get here. So until, as I said, winter's coming. So, and it will be here soon enough for this. And it will be a joint Fatf APG assessment. I should have mentioned as well. So can't give away the ending. But the thing about it is, well, a couple of observations that I mentioned already, that the time frame and the nature of the assessment, and the fact that some of the standards have changed. That having been said, I mean, and also that a lot of the things that were being discussed yesterday by the CEO of AUSTRAC, I mean, she really, as I said in my remarks yesterday, she really was pointing to the stuff of effectiveness. I didn't hear her talk about a lot of rules. I really heard her talk about the types of activities that would add to the fundamentals of going after financial crime and making the preventive measures work more effectively. So that this is a really strong signal in my book. But the overall approach to the assessment is a very broad canvas, and so for all countries, doing a lot of work to get ready is an important part. But more importantly, doing work to have an effective system is the actual important part here. The one observation is the structural one I would make is that Australia is always early in the round for FATF. And I'm not quite sure historically how New Zealand got to be so late. There are some other people here who've been around in this world even longer than me who might remember. But yeah, somehow Australia's near the front and New Zealand's near the back of the round, and so they got a sort of 7-year chance to get it right. Mm-hmm. And there's also an observation that so many banks in New Zealand are owned by Australian banks, so maybe the compliance comes from here as well. Sorry, New Zealand, please don't quote me on this stuff. Yes, I don't. One shouldn't, despite being as close as lips and teeth, I don't think we should necessarily compare the two between the Australian and New Zealand system and the results in all of this, because there's a lot has changed there between the two, and that's not the sort of purpose of these mutual evaluations. So it's not really so much that you'd hold up the Australian mutual evaluation against the Tonga evaluation and the New Zealand one, and then the United States. There are really valuable lessons to learn when looking across assessments in that kind of way, especially at the approaches that national authorities take. But just on the kind of raw scorecard, it's really not. It's not necessarily so instructive. But all I can say is that the real importance that we look for in these assessments, that they're really underpinned so much at the implementation level about how well different actors in the system work together and are working to a common purpose, and that it's really driven by an understanding of risk, and that's your job, I suppose, whether you're from the private sector, or I know that many of you here are from government authorities as well, that the countries that I've assessed who've done really well have just been, this metaphor's not going very well, we've just been dripping with cooperation and coordination and a shared purpose and a real manifestation of agencies working together and working well with a common purpose with the private sector, even if they don't always agree, and plenty of them are getting praised and some are getting in trouble or whatever else it is, but that the sort of settings and the way those settings are supported is a really important part. The last one on that, I also want to say is that there's also the transnational picture as well, is that that the reach of the financial sector in Australia and the great work that it does in its integration with the international financial system and economies in the region and beyond is an important part, and that is picked up in the assessment as well. And I know that for national authorities in countries like Australia and a number of other FATF members, they also have a very strong outward-looking approach. And so that international cooperation piece is one that stands countries in very good stead when that's well supported. And so, so I don't have an answer about how things are going to go, but that so many of the fundamentals are in place, and there's still a road to go.
Well, here's an easier question. Can you talk about some of the highlights of the recent plenary? And what you think is important there, and perhaps particularly what's important for the region.
Sure. So the continuity, I suppose, between the German presidency and so Singapore taking over the presidency of FATF for 2 years, Raja Kumar, who's the Deputy Commissioner of the Singapore Police, will be the FATF president, and he's a steady-handed FATF and has a fantastic team around him, and that I really think that Singaporean authorities will do a very good job of implementing these ministerial priorities that are focused there. It's also, other highlights were that there is, it's hard going, but there is some headway being made in relation to some of these difficult topics, in particular beneficial ownership. So I think it might have come out already, but there'll be a fresh white paper coming out on the topic, for example, of the beneficial ownership and control of trusts, so transparency of control of trusts and other legal arrangements, and further progress in relation to guidance that relates to beneficial ownership of companies and other legal persons. And so we see the picture becoming clearer about what types of expectations are going to be in place. Now, on beneficial ownership and transparency of companies and other legal persons, that standard changed, and you would have seen that coming through in October last year. But the detail in the guidance is also going to be very, very important for countries to work out actually how to do what's required in this new standard. And then eventually they will also set the assessment methodology, which is also an important window into how we'll assess what's required. So that piece of work is very important. Also, as I mentioned yesterday, the work that's continuing and deepening in relation to corruption, including grand corruption, and the continuing work on digital transformation, and then especially the work that's kicking off to look again at the effectiveness of asset recovery. The observations were made last week at FATF that it's about 30 years since the standards have changed on the whole topic of asset recovery, of freezing, seizing and confiscation. And so there is a debate there about between non-conviction-based forfeiture, which is a feature in jurisdictions like Australia, but in many in the region it's not. And then how this, what are some options and how can countries work together to be more effective in this regard? So I think that's a really important area that FATF is moving on. The big issue, which was canvassed last week and will really get ahead of steam, is in relation to getting ready for the next round and then kicking off this next round. So it's going to start, the first reports will be adopted in October 2025, and so the work will begin in 2024. And Fatf hasn't actually decided which countries will go first yet. I'm not a betting man, but I would bet on Australia being in that first group again. But it will make that decision relatively soon, and you need to know as soon as possible. But there's a huge amount of work to get ready, and then there'll be a lot of assessments every year. And so for those of you looking at country risk questions, this was good news in that you'll have better information more regularly. It will also include a third-year follow-up assessment, which will look at both effectiveness and technical compliance issues. And so this is, again, a demand at a global political level from the G20 that they want more up-to-date critical analysis of where countries stand, of how the global network is going. And it's very good news because there's also been a call from the financial sector that you want better information about country risk and about not just a sort of a blanket approach of that country's on a grey list and that one isn't, but actually how are things really going in different national systems, and what does that mean for your settings vis-a-vis customers or transactions and engagement with players in that economy. So that's really good news, but it's a huge amount of work that's sort of coming up. So that's probably one of the biggest outcomes. I mentioned already the issue of the statement in relation to the Ukraine, and then there's continuing work in relation to ICRG. There is important movement on the ICRG lists. You'll see in the public statement from FATF that they've taken a decision to schedule an on-site visit to some countries, including one in our region that's been on the grey list for a long time. And so we are seeing progress for many countries going through that ICRG process more quickly, actually, than in the past. Yeah.
Well, you may be unhappy to know that we're almost out of time, but we are, and perhaps that's a good opportunity to just sort of talk about the future of FATF. I mean, in a way, you've kind of done that by outlining what's happening in the plenary. I mean, I'm aware that there's an ongoing discussion about political influence on FATF going forward, and we now have a new executive secretary, Elaine Clark, who seems to be universally, if I can editorialize, quite admired and whatever. So 10 years out, what's FATF look like? That kind of thing. However you want to sum it up, it's yours. We've abused you enough now. So however you want to sum it up. Sure,
how to sum up. Yeah, so there is a sense of renewal at FATF. I should have mentioned that they made a change 2 years ago to go to a model of a 2-year presidency. And this, I think, is a real strength in that there's a bit more continuity. We've all seen whether you're in an Australian Rules football club or running a country, in those final months of being in charge of things, things taper out or they change in their approach. So 2 years is sort of a 1-year presidency of FATF. It was like, you're doing a few things and then you're almost out, you're almost done. So that I think has sort of helped with some continuity, and also that political drive really. It wasn't that FATF wasn't well supported at a kind of global political level, but it's very strongly so now, and then a renewal in the Secretariat of growth is a real strength as well. The FATF has been making continuing its push to support its global network, so not leaving behind all the other jurisdictions that are not FATF members. So there's only 37 FATF members, and the rest of the 150 or so jurisdictions are outside of FATF, but in its regional bodies. And so to better support those global networks, to do a better job of supporting implementation, and especially to get through the assessment, so that we can really see into where the strengths and weaknesses are and do something about them. So in 10 years' time, the FATF will have finished its round. It will have been working out what to do next, how to become, faster, prettier, funnier, better, cheaper. None of these things are true. Sorry, I should have said it used to be. So it's been a task force for 30 years, and it had very short mandates. And 2 years ago as well, it also decided to have an ongoing life as a task force. The definition of task force is different there than it is other places. So, it has an ongoing remit simply because of the many challenges it faces. And so, my hope that in 10 years' time, the work that it's doing, that it really is absolutely is even more deeply connected to the sorts of the financial sectors that it works to protect. And that the kind of integration in those areas is a lot deeper, and that the discipline of preventing and going after and enforcing measures against financial crime and the abuse of really the protection of societies from abuse and all of the horrible crimes, some of which were canvassed yesterday, and others that we'll hear about, that we're really getting many better results and doing a better job of protecting societies at that for those fundamentals. So the drivers of organised crime and the lifeblood of terrorism and the proliferation of W&D, these fundamental security problems, that really this is what the FATF is about. And we mentioned yesterday the good work that you're all doing, that it's sort of more success there is what I really hope is what we see in 10 years' time. And there are plenty of successes, and I must say, going to FATF meetings and going to APG meetings, working with officials, people are doing amazing work in really difficult circumstances. And so it's your good work that allows that to happen. David, thank you so much. Let's leave it on many successes
Can we all give a round of applause for David? Thank you for putting up with it. I really appreciate it.